Firstly, I want to ask you, have you ever visited Russia before?
No, I haven't. This is my very first visit, and so far I'm so happy. It's better than I expected. It is beautiful, you know. So it's my first visit. I'll tell you, I was a little bit excited, a little apprehensive about coming, and so far it was very easy. It's been very smooth.
Could you tell about your first impression about our country?
It's hard to say. I've had so many impressions. I've only been here a day, yesterday and today. And yesterday I was walking around like a zombie because I hadn't slept all the night before. But my impression was from the people in the hotel and the people I met in the museum and in the restaurants, so friendly, very friendly, St. Petersburg, and welcoming. So I was very pleased with that. I was surprised going through customs. No problem. They didn't even ask me. She just asked for my passport, and then I just went right through. No questions.
Okay. And what about city?
Oh, the city is beautiful. I mean, I've been trying to remind myself of what it reminds me of. It's like Paris, somewhat, a little bit like Amsterdam with all the waterways. It's a beautiful city. I love the architecture, just stunning architecture, and the streets, the cobblestone streets, and the parks, a lot of green. I walked through a big park today near the Russian Museum. I don't remember the name of the park, but it was a beautiful big park.
Okay. And I have a question about your academic topics
yes.
that you studied in recent years.
Okay. Well, I've been teaching philosophy for over 30 years. So my original dissertation and what I study now hasn't really changed that much. I've just gotten deeper and deeper into the same topics. I guess I would call myself an existential phenomenologist. I focused on the 19th and early 20th century with thinkers, especially Soren Kierkegaard. Do you know Kierkegaard? And Husserl, Edmund Husserl. And the one that I've done the most work on, and I've written books on and many articles, is Bernard Lonergan, who was a Canadian philosopher, and but very much influenced by Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Hegel and Husserl. So, but he's 20th century thinker.
Okay,
So those are the thinkers that I've been interested in. But topic that I'm personally interested in is the nature of reflective self-consciousness. What is consciousness, and how is it possible for us to be reflectively aware of ourselves while we're conscious? And that's been the general focus, and then the more specific focus is how that works into our moral consciousness, into decision making.
How your academic work corresponds with consciousness theory, cognitive theory, modern cognitive theory?
Right. How does it connect with modern cognitive theory?
Yes, your academic work.
Well, Lonergan is a mid-20th century, I consider him modern, thinker whose focus is on cognitional theory. And the main question is, how do we understand, and what does it mean, the act of understanding? When you go, oh, I've got it. When you have that moment of discovery, that's what he examines. What is that moment of discovery? And then how does that play a role in the history of science, in the history of philosophy, in all the different, in politics, in moral life. How does insight, how does understanding play a role in all those things?
Okay, and why did you choose these topics?
When I was very young, like in undergraduate, I felt like I understood knowing how we come to make a judgment and know objective truth. But what I didn't understand myself was will. What is the nature of will? How do we get ourselves to get out of inertia to actually act? And so that's my existential interest. I mean, that's why I read Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, you know, all of these, and Sartre. I've done a lot of work on Sartre. So all these people who write about the act of decision and how we go from not doing anything to actually acting. Because it's something personally in my own personal makeup that I was grappling with. I couldn't quite understand it. I felt like the process of cognition was kind of easy to understand, but the whole puzzle about the will, to me, was not easy to understand. So that's what got me started. And I've been pursuing that all my life, basically.
Okay, you take part in the Plato conference,
yes.
And I want to ask you about your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
How the antiquity philosophy may be useful for modern society?
For modern society?
For modern society,
yes.
Or especially for modern young people?
Well, I'm a philosopher, okay? I'm not just a scholar. And for me as a philosopher, and for anyone interested in the pursuit of truth and knowledge, both Plato and Aristotle are the foundation of the whole history of philosophy. I mean, everything has come out of Plato and Aristotle, and they've had an influence on all the later thinkers. Most of the important later thinkers have all been influenced by Plato and Aristotle. So the more I've studied, for myself, the more I've studied Kierkegaard and the more I've studied Lonergan, the more I find them referring back to Plato or back to Aristotle. And I teach Plato and Aristotle a lot to students. And they're classics because you can rediscover new things all the time in them. Now, that's the first part of your question, like why I think Plato and Aristotle are important. But for modern society, and especially for young people, there are two things. I think young people right now there's a kind of disorientation in the world, and a kind of groundlessness, a kind of superficiality. And I think that both Plato and Aristotle bring out a central fact of human life, which is the basic eros of the human spirit, the basic eros that gets us motivated to do something, which is the desire to know. I think a lot of in the modern times right now, people have given up on the idea that there is such a thing as truth, or that even if there is truth, there's no way to get to it. And there's no point. So there's no point pursuing it. And yet they do still have this desire to know. So it's kind of frustrated. So I think by going back to Plato and Aristotle, it may reawaken the idea that there is a central drive in all human beings, cross-cultural, and of any age, old people and young people, to actually know something and a drive to discover. And I would hope that the study of Plato and Aristotle and the study of the ancients could reawaken that for young people so they don't feel disoriented, and also the idea that who's to say? Everything is like, there's no such thing as truth. you say one thing, I say the other, and you end up with a feeling of meaninglessness, like it's all meaningless. I find that in a lot of my students. This kind of relativism, and along with the relativism goes a kind of hopelessness, a kind of like there's no point. So the only thing you can do with your time and your energy is to pour yourself into diversions, to entertainment. But that's such a pointless life, just entertaining yourself. So I think the ancient Greek, the wisdom of Plato and Aristotle can really hopefully reawaken or awaken for the first time in young people the idea that there is something to aim for. It's not all pointless.
I ask this question because, as we know, some modern philosophers tell us about death of metaphysics, and they named Aristotle and Plato as icons of metaphysics. What do you think about death of metaphysics, and in this light, how we can answer about usefulness of ancient philosophers?
Okay, well, first of all, I don't agree with that critique. The critique of the Enlightenment and of modernity, and then along with that, with Plato and Aristotle, is itself driven by modern presuppositions. And so it's not thoroughly re-examined by the postmodernists, like Derrida and Rorty and others. They critique classical metaphysics, but they themselves are holding on to a classical modern ideal of that knowledge is necessary, that there's a necessity in knowledge. It's so that, and then they say, since we can't arrive at it, since there's no necessity, then there's no knowledge, then there's no truth, then there's no pursuit of metaphysics. Pursuit of metaphysics is futile, or it's over. I think that that whole position is insufficiently examined. It's lacking in self-reflection, because they themselves have presuppositions of modernity, of Kant, for example, and Descartes and Kant, that they haven't thoroughly thrown away. So I think that if they go back to the pre-Socratics and to Plato and to Aristotle, they'll discover, I mean, I think that they could discover, I don't know how to put it, answers, let's say, to their questions. But many of them don't have questions. I think that many of them strike me as being somewhat arrogant and self-confident, and they're not even to the point of asking questions. They just declare metaphysics is dead, you know.
I understand.
But I think it's an unexamined position, myself. I don't agree with it.
Okay, I understand. Please tell how the modern academia of your country concerns that study of the antiquity, philosophy and cultures. In the other words, what place the studies of the antiquity are holding in the academic world of your country?
Okay. Well, I teach at a university, undergraduates and graduates. And for the last maybe 2 decades, there has been a big resurgence of interest in virtue theory, and virtue ethics, virtue epistemology. It's virtue, virtue, virtue. And many of the philosophers who pursue this, in my view, are reinventing the wheel. If they don't study Plato and Aristotle seriously, they come up with ideas that have already been articulated even better 2,000 years ago. So I would say that there is an interest for many of the more serious scholars, and they're not all in philosophy. It's in theology, philosophy, and other fields, especially those interested in virtue theory, that they go back to Aristotle, they go back to Plato, and they're finding resources for their interest in virtue theory. Anyway, that's just a new trend. People have given up on cognition, and I think so they're focused on ethics. And in the focusing on ethics, in the last few decades, they have been focusing specifically on virtue. And I don't think you can really say you've studied virtue or you know much what you're talking about if you haven't read Plato and Aristotle on virtue. So there's that. That's one thing I thought of. In the universities in the U.S., across the board, no matter whether you're at a private university, like I'm teaching at a Catholic university, but regardless of whether you're at a Catholic university or a state public university, it doesn't matter. When people teach introduction to philosophy, they usually always teach Plato, because it's a very good way of introducing students to philosophy. And they also, when they teach ethics, everybody does the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle across the whole country. So I think that, Plato and Aristotle have always been taught to philosophy students, regardless of what university you're going to in the United States. And it's still the case.
Okay. Could you tell about your presentation at the conference? Why did you choose this?
For the last number of years, I've been focusing on Bernard Lonergan's notion of conversion. And he has 3 different notions of conversion. Religious conversion, which most people think of when they think of conversion, but also moral conversion, and then intellectual conversion. And just in the last few years, I've been focusing more on intellectual conversion. And this is all towards writing a book. I've done a number of chapters towards finishing this. And now I'm more seriously focusing on just intellectual conversion. Plato's work in the Republic on the very well-known cave allegory is a prime example of intellectual conversion. What I'm doing in this paper is focusing on that, but showing how once the enlightened philosopher, once the person dragged out of the cave becomes enlightened, of course he has to go back into the cave. And most scholars focus on how that is a moral duty. So they focus on it as ethical phenomenon. My interest in this paper is drawing out the cognitional or epistemological dimension of going back. So that's what I'm doing in the paper.
Yes, it's interesting. But why did you choose this topic of your presentation?
Because I'm working on intellectual conversion, and intellectual conversion has 2 phases, and I wanted to see if those 2 phases could be found in Plato, and I think they can.
Okay, imagine that you can influence on the rule.
Just imagine it.
Yes.
Well, right now with the U.S. government, right now, are you talking about the U.S. actual situation in the United States?
Okay.
I would say that it's disastrous, and the denial of truth is part of it, is central. All this stuff about fake news and all the contradictions and all the lying, it goes against everything I stand for. And I hope in teaching students, I can steer them away from that and confirm for them that there is such a thing as truth, and it's important that we search for it. So I don't know how I could personally have an influence except through my students.
Okay. But what do you want to change in sphere of education and in sphere of the antiquity studies?
Well, one thing that I personally have done, and I've seen a few other scholars do this, is just bring out, because I focus on the history of philosophy, and just bring out just how much the later thinkers in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, how much they're indebted to Plato and Aristotle and the pre-Socratics, and to make that more evident. There are a number of people who have done that, like Heidegger, for example. He goes back to the pre-Socratics and emphasizes it. And so I would hope that there is more of that done, that people draw out the great influence of Plato and Aristotle in modern thought.
Okay, please wish something to your Russian colleagues.
Okay, well, first of all, of course, I wish you all the best in your studies, and that you get the support you need from your universities and from the state, so you have the funds to do the studying you want to do. And I really wish that there could be more dialogue between, like, the philosophers in the United States and those in Russia. More conferences like this. I just want to express my gratitude for the organizers of this conference, and for all the welcoming that I've received.
Okay, thank you for the interesting conversation.
Okay, thank you.